The sun beat down on the sprawling asphalt of the San Fernando Valley, making the air shimmer above the ground. Inside the cool, air-conditioned showroom of the high-end motorcycle dealership, the world felt a million miles away. The air smelled of new leather, polished chrome, and a faint, clean scent of motor oil. It was a smell that promised freedom, adventure, and the open road. A man moved through the rows of gleaming motorcycles with a quiet grace, his footsteps barely a whisper on the polished concrete floor. He was dressed in a simple, well-worn t-shirt and faded jeans, his dark hair slightly unruly. To the casual observer, he was just another customer, perhaps a little older than the usual crowd, but with an appreciative eye for the machines. He wasn't loud or demanding. In fact, he was almost invisible. His presence was a low, calm hum in a world that often celebrated noise. He stopped in front of a vintage Ducati, its deep red paint job glowing under the carefully placed spotlights. It was a beautiful machine, a classic design that spoke of speed and elegance. He leaned in slightly, his gaze tracing the lines of the frame. The curve of the handlebars, the perfectly placed instrument cluster. He didn't look like a man who wanted to own the bike. He looked like a man who wanted to understand its soul. He ran a gloved hand over the cool, smooth metal of the fuel tank, feeling the perfect scene where two halves met. It was a work of art, a testament to human ingenuity. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips as he imagined the roar of the engine, the wind whipping past his helmet, the blur of the landscape as he carved through a mountain pass. For a few precious moments, he wasn't a famous actor or a global icon. He was just a rider, connecting with a machine that shared his language. He was lost in this quiet moment of appreciation, a sanctuary of steel and rubber, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away, behind the glass walls of the manager's office. A different kind of storm was raging. The man in charge, whose nameplate on the desk simply read "manager," felt like he was drowning. His office, once a source of pride, now felt like a cage. The walls, lined with photos of classic motorcycles and happy customers, seemed to mock him. Piles of paperwork were stacked precariously on every available surface, a physical representation of the mountain of debt threatening to crush him. A cold cup of coffee sat on his desk, its surface covered in a film of forgotten moments. He was on the phone, his voice a low, strained whisper that was far more menacing than a shout. "No, I understand the position," he said, his free hand nervously tapping a pen against a stack of overdue invoices. "But 30 days is just not enough time. The holiday season is coming. That's our busiest time. If you could just—" He paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked out through the glass wall, his eyes scanning the showroom he had loved his entire life. It was his father's legacy, a place built on passion and a love for the open road. Now every gleaming motorcycle, every piece of chrome, was just another liability, another number on a balance sheet that was bleeding red. "Sir, my father built this place from the ground up," he pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "I have 20 employees, people with families, mortgages. I can't let them down." He listened again, his face growing pale. The voice on the other end was firm, final. There was no more room for negotiation. There was no more sympathy. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "I understand. Thank you for your time." He slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle, the soft click echoing in the silent office like the sound of a prison door slamming shut. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight, and covered his face with his hands. He felt the familiar acid burn of anxiety in his throat. Another month. They wanted him to perform a miracle in another month. He had poured every last penny of his own savings into the business, maxed out his credit cards, and begged family members for loans. It wasn't enough. The bank was going to foreclose. He was going to lose everything. His father's legacy, his employees' jobs, his own identity. It was all going to be gone. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to push back the wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't fall apart. Not here, not now. He had a showroom to run, customers to serve, a business to save. even if it was already too late. He stood up, straightening his tie and forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. He had to be strong. He had to be the manager his father had been. He stepped out of his office, the bright lights of the showroom momentarily blinding him. He scanned the floor, his eyes searching for a potential customer, a lifeline, a miracle. And then he saw him. A man, casually dressed, standing in front of the most expensive motorcycle in the store. A man who looked like he didn't have a care in the world. A man who, in that moment, became the target for all of his frustration, fear, and rage. The click of the phone receiver settling back into its cradle was the loudest sound in the world. It was a final, definitive sound that sealed his fate. For a moment, the manager just sat there, staring at the pile of bills on his desk, the numbers blurring into a meaningless jumble. The weight on his shoulders felt physical, like he was trying to carry the entire building on his back. He could feel a cold sweat prickling his forehead, and his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 30 days. That's what they gave him. 30 days to perform a miracle, to turn back time, to erase years of slow decline and a few very bad months. It was impossible. He knew it. They knew it. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in his lungs. He couldn't sit here and drown in his own misery. He had a job to do. He had people depending on him. He pushed his chair back, a leg scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up. He walked over to the small window in his office door and looked out at the showroom. It was his kingdom, or at least it used to be. Now it felt like a museum of his failures. He saw his employees moving around, polishing chrome, adjusting mirrors, trying to look busy for the few customers who were browsing. He saw the hope in their eyes, the trust they placed in him. He couldn't let them see him like this. He couldn't let them smell the fear coming off him in waves. He straightened his tie, a gesture that felt ridiculous and pointless, and forced his lips into a shape that resembled a smile. It felt like his face was cracking. He had to be the manager. He had to be the man his father was, a man who could walk onto a floor and command respect, a man who could close a deal with a handshake and a confident grin. He was not that man. He was a ghost wearing that man's clothes. He opened the door and stepped out onto the showroom floor, the bright lights making him squint. The familiar smells of leather and gasoline usually brought him comfort, but today they just smelled like debt. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for an easy target, a customer who looked ready to sign, a lifeline he could grab onto. And then he saw them. Over by the vintage Ducati, one of his youngest salesmen was talking to a customer. The salesman was a good kid, eager and polite, but still a little green. He was trying his best, gesturing to the bike's features, his voice a little too loud, a little too rehearsed. The customer, the quiet man in the simple clothes, was listening patiently. The manager watched them, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He felt a surge of irritation. Why was the kid wasting time on a lucre? The man didn't look like he had the money for a coffee, let alone a classic Ducati. He needed a sale, a real sale, not a tire kicker wasting precious time. He started to walk towards them, his mind already forming a polite but firm way to take over the conversation, to steer the kid towards a more promising prospect. But then he stopped. He was close enough now to hear their conversation, or at least to see it unfold. He watched as the quiet man leaned in, pointing to something on the fuel tank. The manager's heart sank. He knew what it was. It was a scratch. A tiny, almost invisible scratch right near the gas cap. It had happened during shipping, a stupid, careless accident that they had tried to buff out but couldn't completely remove. It was the bike's one flaw, the one thing they always tried to distract customers from. He saw the young salesman's face fall, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He saw the customer's finger trace the line of the scratch. The manager's blood began to boil. Here we go, he thought. Another rich guy coming in here to find a flaw, to chip away at the price, to make him feel small. He couldn't hear the man's words, but he could imagine them. Well, what's this? For this price I expect perfection. He saw the quiet man's lips move, and then he smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile or a mocking smile. It was just a small, gentle smile. But the manager didn't see it that way. Through the filter of his own rage and desperation, he saw a predator who had just found his weakness. He saw a man who was enjoying this, who was taking pleasure in pointing out the imperfections in his life's work. The scratch on the bike wasn't just a scratch anymore. It was the crack in the foundation of his business. It was the final notice from the bank. It was the disappointed look in his father's eyes. It was everything that was wrong with his life, all contained in one tiny silver line on a red gas tank. The pressure that had been building inside him for months, the anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, it all came rushing to the surface. It was like a volcano erupting, and he was the mountain about to blow. He forgot about the young salesman. He forgot about the other customers in the store. He forgot about being a manager, a professional, a rational human being. All he could see was the man in front of him, the man who represented everything he had lost and everything he was about to lose. He took a step forward, then another. His movements were stiff, robotic. He felt like he was watching himself from a distance, a spectator to his own destruction. He brushed past the young salesman, putting a hand on his chest to push him gently but firmly aside. "I'll handle this," he heard himself say, his voice a low growl that didn't sound like his own. The young salesman looked confused, scared. The quiet customer looked up, his calm, friendly expression faltering as he saw the look on the manager's face. He saw the raw, unfiltered rage burning in his eyes. He saw a man who was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall. The manager stopped in front of him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words that came out were not the ones he had planned. They were not polite or professional. They were the words of a man who had nothing left to lose. The words that came out of the manager's mouth were not his own. They were the words of a desperate man, a man backed into a corner with no way out. They were sharp and jagged like broken glass, and they cut through the quiet hum of the showroom. "You think this is a joke?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The quiet man looked up, his friendly expression dissolving into one of pure confusion. His eyes, which had been moments ago filled with a gentle appreciation for the motorcycle, now held a flicker of alarm. He saw the raw, untamed rage burning in the manager's eyes, a rage so intense it seemed to have a life of its own. The air between them grew thick and heavy, charged with a tension that was almost visible. The young salesman took a half-step back, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. He had never seen his boss like this. The manager took another step closer, invading the quiet man's personal space. His shoulders squared, his body coiled like a spring. "You come in here, dressed like you're just slumming it, looking down your nose at my place," he continued, his voice rising with each word. The stress of the last few months, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, it all came pouring out of him in a torrent of accusation. He wasn't just talking to this one man anymore. He was talking to the bank, to the economy, to the cruel twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. He saw the man's simple clothes not as a sign of humility, but as a disguise, a costume worn by a wealthy man to mock those who had less. He saw the man's quiet nature not as a sign of a gentle soul, but as a condescending silence, a judgment passed without a word being spoken. The quiet man opened his mouth to speak, to try and understand what was happening, but the manager was on a roll, a runaway train of anger and pain. "You point out that scratch like you're some kind of expert? Like you get some kind of pleasure out of finding a flaw? Out of reminding me that my business, my life's work, isn't perfect?" He was shaking now, his hands trembling at his sides. He felt a hot tear of frustration slide down his cheek, and he angrily wiped it away. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and he hated it. He hated this man for making him feel this way. The quiet man finally found his voice, his tone soft and placating. "Hey, I wasn't trying to... I was just making an observation. It's a beautiful bike. A scratch like that just gives it character, you know? It's got a story." He offered a small, hesitant smile, a peace offering. But the manager was too far gone to see it. He was lost in a fog of his own making. The word character was like a match to a gasoline-soaked rag. It was the most condescending thing he had ever heard. It was the kind of thing a person who has everything says to a person who has nothing. It was a pat on the head, a dismissal of his entire struggle. Character? He spat, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. You think this is about character? You think my father's legacy, the jobs of 20 people, is just some story for you to enjoy? His vision was narrowing, the edges blurring until all he could see was the man's face. The man's calm, understanding face that he now perceived as the most arrogant, mocking thing he had ever seen. The world around him faded away. The other customers, the gleaming motorcycles, the young salesman's panicked face, it all disappeared. There was only him and the man in front of him, the symbol of everything he had lost and everything he would never have. And then something inside him snapped. It was a clean break, like a rope stretched too taut. The rage, the desperation, the hopelessness, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of action. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just acted. His arm moved of its own accord, a clumsy, awkward motion that was fueled by pure, unadulterated emotion. His fist, clenched so tightly his knuckles were white, flew through the air. It wasn't a powerful punch, not like in the movies. It was a desperate, flailing act, a final, pathetic cry for help from a man who had already given up. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the quiet man's eyes widen in shock, saw him start to flinch back, but he was too slow. The manager's fist connected with the side of his jaw. There was a sickening thud, a dull, wet sound that echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the showroom. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. For a moment, nothing happened. The quiet man's head snapped to the side. He stumbled back a step, his hand flying to his face. The force of the blow wasn't what knocked him off balance. It was the sheer, shocking unexpectedness of it. The manager stood frozen, his arm still extended, his fist still clenched. The rage that had been coursing through his veins just seconds before was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. In its place was a cold, creeping horror. He looked at his own hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if it were a foreign object that had somehow attached itself to his arm. He looked at the man he had just struck, who was now looking at him with an expression not of anger, but of profound, bewildered hurt. The young salesman let out a choked gasp. A woman who had been looking at a helmet across the room dropped it with a clatter. The entire dealership was frozen in a state of shock, a silent tableau of disbelief. The manager's mind was a blank slate. The adrenaline that had fueled his outburst had drained away, leaving him feeling weak, shaky, and empty. The reality of what he had just done came crashing down on him like a physical blow. He had just assaulted a customer in his own showroom, in front of witnesses. He hadn't just ruined his business. He had ruined his life. He was going to be arrested. He was going to be sued. He was going to be on the news, the disgraced manager who punched a customer. He saw his father's face in his mind's eye, not angry, but disappointed. That was worse than anything. He saw the faces of his employees, their trust in him shattered. He saw the foreclosure notice on his desk, no longer a threat, but a certainty. He had just thrown the final punch in the fight for his own life, and he had knocked himself out. His hand began to tremble uncontrollably. He slowly lowered his arm, his fingers uncurling. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He wanted to run, to hide, to turn back time and undo that one terrible, irreversible moment. But it was too late. The line had been crossed, and he was standing on the wrong side of it all alone. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing down on everyone in the room, sucking out all the air. The only sound was the low, almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning system, a sound that was usually comforting but now felt like the drone of a dying insect. The manager remained frozen, his arm still half raised as if caught in a photograph. His fist, the instrument of his own destruction, slowly uncurled, and he stared at his own palm as if he were looking at a stranger's hand. It was just a hand with lines and wrinkles and familiar calluses, but it had committed an act of unforgivable violence. It had just thrown away his entire life. His mind was a frantic, scrambled mess of horrifying images. He saw flashing police lights in the showroom's reflection. He saw himself in a cold, sterile interrogation room. He saw the headline on the news, his face blurred out next to a picture of the man he had attacked. He saw the foreclosure sign being hammered into the pristine lawn in front of the dealership his father had built with sweat and love. A cold dread, colder than anything he had ever felt, washed over him, and he thought he might be sick. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his knees threatening to buckle. He was a dead man walking. The young salesman stood a few feet away, his face a mask of pure terror. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He was looking from his boss to the customer, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was a kid in over his head, witnessing a scene he couldn't possibly comprehend. Other customers in the showroom had stopped what they were doing. A couple who had been admiring a leather jacket were now staring openly, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. A man near the entrance had already pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, ready to record the next inevitable act of this unfolding drama. The manager could feel their eyes on him, dozens of tiny, judgmental lenses focusing in on his shame. He was an exhibit in a museum of failure, but the quiet man was the one who held everyone's attention. He had stumbled back a step, his hand rising to his jaw. He gently touched the spot where the manager's fist had landed, a slow, deliberate movement. There was no anger in his eyes, no immediate desire for retaliation. There was only a deep, profound confusion, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. He processed the physical sensation, a dull, throbbing ache that was already beginning to spread. But as he stood there, rubbing his jaw, his focus began to shift. He wasn't looking at his own pain anymore. He was looking at the man in front of him. He saw the manager's pale, ashen face. He saw the trembling in his hands, the way his shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw the raw, naked terror in his eyes, a terror that went far beyond the fear of getting into trouble. He saw a man who was broken, a man who had reached the absolute end of his rope and lashed out not from a place of malice, but from a place of utter desperation. The quiet man's expression softened. The confusion in his eyes was replaced by something else, something that no one in that room, least of all the manager, could have possibly expected. It was empathy. It was a deep, quiet understanding that transcended the violence of the moment. He saw past the punch, past the aggression, and saw the pain that had caused it. And in that moment, he made a decision. He decided to respond not to the action, but to the person. He took a step forward. It was a small movement, but it was like a thunderclap in the silent room. The young salesman flinched, expecting another attack. The manager flinched, bracing for a retaliation he knew he deserved. But the quiet man's movement was not aggressive. It was calm, steady, and deliberate. He closed the small distance between them, stopping just a foot away from the manager. He lowered his hand from his jaw, and his gaze met the manager's. The manager couldn't hold it. He dropped his eyes to the floor, unable to face the man he had just struck. Consumed by a wave of shame so powerful it felt like it might crush him. He was ready for the yelling, the threats, the arrival of security. He was ready for his punishment. But what came next was something his mind could not process. "Hey," the quiet man said. His voice was soft, gentle, almost a whisper. It was the kind of voice you would use to talk to a frightened animal. The manager looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you okay?" the quiet man asked. The question hung in the air, impossible and absurd. "Are you okay?" He had just been assaulted, and he was asking if his attacker was okay. The manager's brain short-circuited. He just stared, his mouth slightly agape, unable to form a single word. He must have misheard. There was no way. The quiet man saw the confusion on his face and continued, his tone still impossibly calm. "It looks like you're having a really, really bad day." He glanced past the manager, towards the glass-walled office, where the piles of paperwork and the single, cold cup of coffee were visible. He saw the story written in the clutter and the manager's haggard appearance. "Let's just take a breath," he said, his own breathing slow and even, as if to demonstrate. He then turned his attention to the rest of the room. To the young salesman who was still frozen in fear, to the customers with their phones out. "Nobody call the police," he said, his voice a little clearer now, but still filled with an undeniable authority that came not from anger, but from a place of pure compassion. "It's all right." The young salesman slowly lowered his phone, his face a picture of utter bewilderment. The man by the entrance put his phone away, a look of grudging respect on his face. The tension in the room began to dissipate, not with a bang, but with a slow, steady release, like air escaping from a balloon. The manager felt his knees finally give way. He would have fallen to the floor if the quiet man hadn't reached out a steadying hand, placing it gently on his shoulder. The touch was not a threat. It was an anchor. And with that simple act of kindness, the dam inside the manager finally broke. The rage, the fear, the despair, it all came rushing out, but not in another explosion of anger. It came out as a choked sob. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking as the tears he had been holding back for months finally streamed down his face. He wasn't crying because he was sorry, though he was. He was crying because he was seen. In his lowest, most shameful moment, this man, this stranger he had just violently attacked, had looked past the monster and seen the man underneath. And he had shown him grace. It was more than he could bear. The quiet man waited patiently, his hand still on the manager's shoulder, a silent, steady presence in the eye of the storm. He let him cry, giving him the space to release all the pain and frustration he had been carrying for so long. When the manager's sobs finally subsided into quiet, ragged breaths, the quiet man spoke again. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's not do this out here. Let's go to your office." He gently guided the broken manager towards the glass-walled room, supporting him as they walked. The other employees and customers watched in stunned silence as they disappeared into the office, the quiet man closing the door behind them, leaving the rest of the world to wonder what had just happened and what would happen next. The click of the office door closing was a soft, final sound. It shut out the stunned silence of the showroom, creating a new, more intimate silence in the small, cluttered space. The manager didn't dare look up. He just stood in the middle of the room, his head bowed, a prisoner awaiting his sentence. His office, which had felt like a cage of his own making, now felt like a confessional. He could feel the quiet man's presence, a calm, steady energy that seemed to absorb the chaos radiating from him. He expected the man to start yelling, to demand to know why he had been attacked. He expected him to pull out his phone and call the police right here, right now. He braced himself for the sound of a dial tone, for the cold, official voice of a 911 operator. But none of that happened. Instead, he heard the quiet, gentle sound of a chair being pulled out. Then another. "Sit down," the quiet man said. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even firm. It was just a simple suggestion, spoken with a kindness that felt like a physical blow to the manager's shattered pride. He slowly sank into his own worn leather chair, the one he'd spent 1,000 sleepless nights in. He kept his eyes fixed on a stain on the carpet, a dark, coffee-shaped ring that he'd been meaning to clean for months. It seemed like a metaphor for his entire life, a small, ugly stain he couldn't get rid of. The quiet man sat in the chair on the other side of the desk, the one usually reserved for unhappy customers or job applicants. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, giving the manager space to breathe, to exist in his own misery. Finally, the manager could bear the silence no longer. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. I don't know what happened. I snapped." He risked a glance up, and what he saw in the quiet man's eyes was not judgment, but a deep, patient understanding. It was unnerving. He would have preferred anger. He knew how to deal with anger. But this was something else entirely. "Why don't you tell me about it?" the quiet man said softly. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation. And that was all it took. The dam that had been patched up with desperation and fear for so long finally burst completely. The manager began to talk. At first, the words came out in a jumbled, incoherent rush. He talked about the bank, the foreclosure notice, the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling. He talked about his father, how he had built this place from nothing with his own 2 hands, and how his son, was running it into the ground. He talked about his employees, the young salesman with a new baby, the mechanic with a sick wife, good people who trusted him, people he was about to let down in the most spectacular way possible. As he spoke, the quiet man just listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He didn't even move. He just sat there, his full attention on the man unraveling in front of him, creating a safe space for his confession. The manager's voice cracked as he recounted the phone call from the bank. The finality of it, the feeling of being cornered with no way out. He described the rage that had built up inside him, a poison that had been simmering for months, and how seeing the man pointing out the scratch on the Ducati had been the final, tiny push that sent him over the edge. "It wasn't about you," he said, tears streaming down his face again. "It was never about you. You were just, you were the symbol of everything I've lost, everything I'm about to lose. I'm so sorry. I'll understand if you call the police. I deserve it. I'll lose my business, my home, everything. But you have to know, I am so sorry for what I did to you." When he was finished, he was completely drained. He slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of a man. He had laid his soul bare, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for the verdict. The quiet man was silent for a moment, letting the manager's words hang in the air. Then he leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to press charges," he said. The manager's head snapped up. He stared at the quiet man, his mind struggling to process the words. It was like being told he had won the lottery. It was an act of grace so immense, so undeserved, that it didn't feel real. But I hit you," the manager stammered. "I assaulted you." "You did," the quiet man agreed, his tone still gentle. "But I've been around long enough to know the difference between a man who is evil and a man who is having a very, very bad day. You're not a bad person. You're just a person who's in a lot of pain." He paused, then a small, familiar smile touched his lips. "And I still want the bike." The manager's jaw dropped. This was beyond comprehension. Not only was he not going to jail, but this man, this incredible man, still wanted to do business with him? I can't let you do that," the manager said, shaking his head. "Not after what I did." "I insist," the quiet man said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. The manager watched in a state of surreal disbelief as the quiet man began to write. He wrote out a figure that covered the full asking price for the vintage Ducati, the one with the scratch. He tore the check from the book and slid it across the desk. But he wasn't done. He took out the checkbook again and began to write a second check. This one was for a much larger amount. What's this for?" the manager asked, his voice trembling. "That's for that black sports car in the corner," the quiet man said, nodding towards the showroom. "The one nobody's been able to afford? I've always kind of liked it." He slid the second check across the desk to join the first. The manager stared at the 2 pieces of paper. They weren't just checks. They were a lifeline. They were a miracle. They were the answer to a prayer he hadn't even known he was praying. The total amount was more than enough to pay off the bank, to save the business, to give him a fresh start. He looked up at the quiet man, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was painful. "Why?" he whispered, the single word filled with a universe of emotion. The quiet man stood up, his work done. He looked down at the manager, his expression kind and wise. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said simply. "Don't let the bad day win. Take care of this place. It's special." And with that, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving the manager alone with 2 checks that would change his life forever. The manager sat there for a long time, just looking at the checks, then at the door through which the quiet man had disappeared. He eventually stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the showroom floor. He saw the young salesman talking to a customer, a genuine smile on his face. He saw the sunlight glinting off the chrome of the motorcycles. He saw his dealership, not as a burden, but as a legacy, a second chance. The story eventually got out, not as a scandal, but as a powerful testament to the unexpected kindness of a stranger. The manager, humbled and forever changed by the encounter, ran his business with a new philosophy. He learned to see the person behind the customer, to listen more than he talked, and to always remember that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And sometimes the most profound reaction to violence is not more violence, but a quiet, steady, and life-changing act of grace. The scratch on the red Ducati was never buffed out. It remained, a small, silver line that served as a constant reminder of the day a man's world fell apart, and the day a quiet stranger helped him put it back together again.